spent 11 years of my life in Switzerland because it's 5 o'clock in Europe. So I'm going to start the seminar. Waiting for it to sign in YouTube so that it's not interrupted. Okay, so hello and welcome everyone. Good morning, United States. Good afternoon, Europe, and wherever else you are in the world. My name is Carsten Schradin. It's a pleasure to see all of you again. I'm based in the CNRS in Strasbourg, and it's my pleasure to be the host of the fine seminar today. What you see here is the program of the upcoming weeks. Today and next week, we have 2 slots for what we call Rising Stars, because we also want to give young researchers the opportunity to show their research in the fine. I think I try to stress it during every seminar that behavioral ecology is at its beginning. I'm very interested how the field will develop in the coming decades. And so we also need to listen, or want to listen, and will be a pleasure to listen to the young people. Then in October, end of October, Karen Strier, a very well-established scientist, takes over. And very interestingly, the 3rd of November will be a very interesting day for all of us because of the talk by Peter Kappeler and some small election happening over the pond in the United States. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome today John Scott Martin, who is at the moment a PhD student at the University of Zurich, but he already has authored and co-authored 12 scientific publications, more than many people have achieved after the PhD. So he can be really said to be a rising star. And it's also, when you look at on ResearchGate, papers in really well-ranked journals. Like, I think today we will hear a lot about his paper in the Proceedings, but there has also been papers in Biology Letters, PNAS, and there was something in Methods in Ecology and Evolution, showing that he is very productive and especially also doing interesting work empirically, but also on a mathematical level. So Jordan, he did his bachelor degrees in Ohio at Miami University, as some of us just heard, where he enjoyed lectures by Nancy Solomon, who is also here in the audience. And then he went actually for a 1-year exchange to Austria, to Vienna, to work in Thomas Bugmia's group. So also getting a very good overview of animal behavior and probably cognition over there in Vienna. Getting back to the United States, to Emory University, where he did his master's and where he worked together with Adrian Jaeggi, who is now a professor at the University of Zurich at a very interesting Institute of Evolutionary Medicine. And as Adrian got a professorship there in Zurich 1 or 2 years ago, Jordan followed him and is now a PhD student in Adrian's group, and working there especially and also on evolution of sociality in humans, which will be the main topic of the talk today, to which I'm looking very much forward. John.
All right, well, thank you very much, Carsten. That was a very flattering introduction. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Okay, can everybody see that? Looks good, okay. All right, well, thank you very much to Carsten and the other organizers for inviting me to take part in the FIND seminar. And although they've set out some slots for PhD students, I have to say it's very humbling as a PhD student to present after so many great talks from more senior colleagues. So I hope I do some justice in taking up your hour here, or 2 hours. And I should also preface my talk by emphasizing that despite the very broad title that I decided to go with, I'm not going to be giving anything close to an exhaustive review of all comparative research, directly or indirectly relevant to human sociality. Rather, I'd like to reflect more broadly on what I see as being some of the key benefits of taking a comparative approach to understanding human behavior in general. And I'd like to also show how they've informed some of my own empirical research, which I hope will be of general interest and generate some useful discussion. As we've been hearing throughout the seminar so far, social interactions are central to the adaptive evolution of behavior. And there are, countless examples, textbook examples, and each of us has our own taxa that we'd like to focus on, but I'd like to just highlight a few that I find particularly interesting. For example, cooperative and competitive interactions, we know, play a key role in the evolution of a variety of affiliative behaviors, such as allopreening in avian societies, facilitates the maintenance of pair bonds, as well as various more elaborate cooperative behaviors, such as territorial patrolling in wild chimpanzees, and the more extensive division of labor that we observe in eusocial colonies. And of course, these interspecific patterns are also observed interspecifically and can facilitate the evolution of many elaborate and highly complex behavioral adaptations, ranging from cooperative group hunting between moray eels and grouper fish to the highly parasitic interactions among cuckoos and the species whose broods they parasitize. Although much of the research within animal behavior and behavioral ecology has focused on the evolution of these specific social behaviors within or among species, including my own work, it's also become increasingly clear from a broader perspective on the history of life that social interactions are also key to explaining many of the major transitions that we've observed throughout the evolution of life on Earth, including many independent transitions from unicellularity to multicellularity, as well as transitions from asexual to sexual reproduction. And over the last half century, extensive empirical and theoretical research have led to the development of a growing body of integrative theory, social evolutionary theory, which shows how these otherwise quite distinct processes of group formation and group transformation can be explained by common evolutionary and ecological principles. And in addition, this framework has helped to narrow and channel research efforts into addressing some of the most fundamental questions in the evolution of sociality, which, as Stuart West argues in his 2015 paper, are, or at least some of the big questions are, what conditions favor the formation of cooperative groups, group transformation and division of labor, but also the evolution of mechanisms for coordination and communication within these groups, and mechanisms that reduce within group conflict, and as well as the conditions that favor mutual dependence. And I hope to hit a little bit on each of these throughout my talk. So with the development of this very generalizable theory, we've also begun to see efforts arise to establish integrative empirical frameworks for organizing and directing comparative research. As a great example, a recent edited volume by Dustin Rubenstein and Patrick Abbott that I particularly liked, called Comparative Social Evolution. And in that, in the final chapter of their volume, they propose a integrative framework for understanding what are otherwise very highly heterogeneous and often incompatible terminologies that are used to describe sociality across different animal lineages, and focuses attention on the fact that although we often find group structure, reproductive structure, alloparental care, and genetic structure to correlate in particular ways within specific lineages, each of these traits can and does evolve semi-independently and respond potentially to distinct selection pressures. And so by engaging in this very generalizable theory and attempting to systematize our research, we can begin to engage in broad explanatory frameworks that can integrate our understanding of things such as reproductive division of labor across otherwise very disparate systems like green algae, eusocial insects, and as observed in many mammalian societies as well. And I think now in 2020, we can say that the fruits of this last half century of theoretical and empirical labor are now more apparent than ever, showing just to me, I think the very impressive explanatory power of social evolutionary theory. For example, I'm sure everyone here knows very well, we now know that genetic relatedness has been repeatedly demonstrated to be a common factor explaining otherwise disparate empirical patterns, such as the evolution of helping behavior across avian societies, as well as the emergence of cooperative breeding, as indicated by white dots across mammalian societies. And similar patterns have even been observed in explaining the repeated independent evolution of obligate multicellularity across eukaryotes and bacteria, indicated by black dots, where we see that multicellularity has only evolved in lineages that were ancestrally clonal. So I think something that Bill Hamilton would probably not be surprised to learn. And in addition to the predicted effects of population structure, we've also found that common ecological pressures can explain variation in sociality across the domains of life. Predation pressure, for example, has been found to explain variation in the sex composition of primate societies. And as Michael Taborski discussed in his talk, we also see the role of predation in explaining within species plasticity and social complexity among African cichlids, as well as even within species plasticity among cyanobacteria in response to other bacteria that prey upon them. So very generalizable explanatory power. And given the well-established and empirically supported foundations of social evolutionary theory, in my own research, I've been very interested in trying to understand how this framework can help us to explain some of the otherwise exceptional features of human social behavior, as well as the potential role that humans might play as a model system for testing and potentially expanding upon some of the key predictions of this theory. And this is because humans, or why I think humans are a good model system, is because we exhibit cooperative behavior and cooperative interactions in nearly every aspect of our lives, which I think is so apparent that it can be quite easily overlooked. And from a theoretical perspective, we can think about breaking this cooperation up into distinct, functionally distinct forms of behavior, each of which works together to support human life history and development. And often this is referred to as human hypercooperation or ultrasociality, which includes not only extensive forms of collaboration, communication, and social and cultural learning, but also key behaviors like proactive food sharing, cooperative foraging, and intergenerational transfers between grandparents, their grandkids, and their children. As well as extensive behavioral diversity, due both to plastic responses to local ecological contexts and cultural variation, which we observe across the globe. But even then, despite the variation we observe across groups, human groups across the globe, we also find that within these groups, there is extensive individual variation, explained not only by the division of labor and behavioral specialization, but also other aspects of personality, which facilitate individual variation. One of the reasons that I think explaining the evolution of human sociality is interesting is because we now know that human societies have historically been characterized by relatively low genetic relatedness. So classically, many anthropologists and other social scientists emphasize the importance of kinship as a fundamental mechanism in structuring the shape of human social groups. And this led some evolutionary social scientists to argue that the kinds of cooperation that we observe in large-scale human societies might not be adaptive responses, but instead reflect mismatch due to what's often either seriously or pejoratively referred to as a Stone Age mind, meaning that our minds have evolved to engage in cooperative behaviors in the context of small kin groups. And so when we very rapidly find ourselves in the context of very large scale societies interacting with strangers, we exhibit maladaptive behavior because of constraints due to the proximate mechanisms of that behavior. However, despite the persistence of some of these arguments in the literature, we now know from genetic data that there's very strong evidence against this conclusion. And in fact, we see that within small scale foraging societies like the Aceh, that individual social partners and their social interactions largely consist of interactions with genetically unrelated individuals, many of whom are linked through familial social networks, which in this graph are called affines, rather than genetic ancestry per se. So this is just showing for a typical Aceh, the distribution of their social network and who they're interacting with. And so this suggests that kinship is important to human sociality, but ultimately insufficient to explain the kinds of cooperation we see both in small scale and large scale societies. Now, of course, humans are not unique in this regard. There are many other animal species that exhibit very cooperative behavior in the context of low average group relatedness. For example, some of my favorite examples are the Taiwan hyena, who engage in cooperative breeding in the context of groups with very low levels of genetic relatedness, as well as some eusocial species like paper wasp, where many nestmates are unrelated to one another. And it's clear from empirical research on these systems and others that in the absence of genetic relatedness as a means of reducing within group reproductive competition, other mechanisms, behavioral or physiological, that facilitate reproductive suppression and enforcement of reproductive division of labor are key for explaining how these species maintain high levels of cooperation despite relatively low levels of relatedness. But while we know that punishment and other means of enforcement do play a key role in stabilizing various human institutions and cultural norms, it doesn't get us very far in, or these mechanisms don't get us very far in explaining how human sociality evolved through genetic evolution, or in other words, how these cultural institutions and means of punishment arose in the first place. So for example, we now have data from a variety of small-scale societies on the proportion of individuals who are reproductively active or not, or have been throughout their entire life. And here you can see some work from Cody Ross and colleagues demonstrating that by the age of 45 in this case, for both males and females, there tends to be more than 90% of individuals that are at least at some point in their lives reproductively active and having children. So there are very, very few individuals that are not having children, and there's not clear reproductive division of labor, as is often found in other highly social species. And as might be expected as a consequence of this, we also observe non-trivial rates of reproductive skew, particularly among males across human societies. And here at the top, you can see from some work by Wilson and colleagues, rates of maximum number of offspring across societies, as well as standardized variance at the bottom. And if you compare, for example, average rates across many of these societies to other primates, in this case, at the top, you see rhesus macaques and mandrills, we see that many human societies show comparable rates of reproductive skew to highly polygynandrous species like rhesus macaques. So there's reproductive competition continues to be important for explaining human evolution, and probably was in the past as well. Rather than relying on reproductive suppression or genetic relatedness, it appears that humans have instead evolved to rely on interpersonal and interfamilial networks of reciprocity and collective action, which function to pool risk among many mutually independent individuals, and thus potentially to buffer them against the risk of energetic shortfalls. And we know that these networks of resource sharing and mutual dependence also take place in the context of larger multi-level societies, even in the context of foraging societies or other societies that are typically characterized as being small scale. We see that even in these groups, these localized networks take place in very complex multi-level structures, which, as has recently been demonstrated among the Agta, have been argued to facilitate rapid cultural adaptation to the environment through extensive diffusion and recombination of social information. So individuals are transferring between groups, and they're sharing information with others, sharing resources with others, and this creates a very dynamic and plastic and responsive social structure. And in addition, we also know that humans exhibit exceptional degrees of social plasticity, in addition to the importance of factors like behavioral specialization and division of labor. For example, in very mobile, small-scale societies like the Hadza, recent work has found that differences in social norms among short-term groups explain much more variation in cooperative behavior than stable between individual variation per se. So here in this graph, you can see 3 groups, and the triangles indicate individuals who in an economic game were uncooperative, and the circles indicate highly cooperative individuals. And you can see that despite some variation, the pattern is very mostly explained by between group variation. And interestingly, by tracking these individuals over time, they found that it wasn't that individuals were consistent in their strategy, but rather that they were adapting to local norms. So these are otherwise relatively rare mechanisms, but appear to also be capable of handling some of the competitive risks that otherwise might suppress the evolution of the extensive cooperation we see in human societies. But despite this, and while I would argue that these features do make humans a particularly exciting model system for studying and testing evolutionary theory of sociality, many researchers, both in the biological and the social sciences, continue to doubt whether evolutionary theory and comparative research in general can tell us much of anything, in particular about human evolution, and vice versa, in terms of the relevance for human evolution to understanding evolution and other taxa. For example, in a recent special issue discussing humans' role in evolutionary biology, philosopher Kim Sterlini argued that while humans are an exceptional product of evolution, this also makes them quite unsuitable model systems for understanding basically anything that people are interested in understanding about human evolution, because these are all complex extreme cases that are likely shaped by mechanisms that play little to no role in other species. And this is not just a position held by some philosophers or social scientists, but is also something that many evolutionary biologists, at least when surveyed in private, agree with. So for example, Michael Brigga and colleagues recently surveyed evolutionary biologists about the role of humans in evolution, evolutionary ecological studies. And they found that about a fourth of researchers disagreed that humans continue to evolve by natural selection. And conversely, that they agreed that both culture and the lack of a, quote, natural environment are fundamental limitations in the relevance of human research, the relevance of evolutionary ecology to explaining human variation. And so in general, there is an attitude among many researchers, whether or not they may be the exception within evolutionary social science, that human studies are not necessarily going to be informed very much by comparative research, and instead should rely on potentially human-specific theoretical frameworks. And I think that we can see from this perspective, although it's informed by theory and empirical research, that in essence, what many researchers have done is they have taken a kind of classical scale of nature picture, which we all disparage, both amongst ourselves as well as in teaching about evolutionary theory, and basically have taken this scale of nature and transformed it into one which is now scientifically more palatable, where humans are not necessarily separated from nature in some kind of metaphysical way, but instead through our ingenuity and our limitless cultural and technological prowess, we've somehow disjointed ourselves from the entire history of life on Earth. And this is an illustration from one of Frans de Waal's articles that I really particularly love. I think it summarizes this point really nicely. So despite the clear role of culture and technology and various other aspects of human uniqueness in explaining the variation that we observe among human societies, as well as the self-evident uniqueness of humans as animals, I would argue that such conclusions are, one, empirically premature, and two, ultimately theoretically unsatisfying. If human uniqueness is to have any scientific utility, we need to understand and clearly define the specific ways in which our species is unique, as well as use general principles to understand how we got here from an ancestral state that presumably lacked these features. Therefore, regardless of whether one likes to envision humans as being more godlike or more like naked apes, we ultimately need an integrative comparative approach to understand how and why humans evolved such rare forms of social interaction. And first and foremost, I think this involves actually empirically testing the predictions of evolutionary ecological theory, rather than simply assuming they are irrelevant or otherwise need to be reinvented for the specific context of human interactions. In addition, we need phylogenetic comparative studies, both across species as well as across human societies, to disentangle the selection pressures and inheritance mechanisms that may underlie the distinct traits which in aggregate contribute to human sociality as broadly defined. And of course, this means not only understanding humans as primates in particular, but also understanding human traits as one of potentially many instances of convergent evolution across the tree of life. So rather than beginning with exceptionalism as something to be explained, which is a key part of many research programs studying the evolution of human sociality, I would instead argue that we need to invoke the concept of exceptionalism only when necessary. And so to accomplish this kind of research program, I think it's absolutely crucial that researchers draw on interdisciplinary theory and methods, both from the social and biological sciences, and that we always heed the advice of Tinbergen in addressing human sociality, both from its proximate and its ultimate levels of explanation. To further demonstrate, I think, the value and importance of comparative approaches, I think we can also look to some of the limitations of what I would call human-specific theory that has already been developed within the evolutionary social sciences. And by this, I mean theories that are specifically meant to explain humans with no intention of generalization to other taxa, as opposed to general evolutionary ecological theory that's brought together to bear on and explain specific details of human evolution. So broadly, I like to think about these human-specific theories as taking on two flavors. The first are what we might call grand coevolutionary theories. And these are often characterized by incredibly dense path diagrams with lots of circular pathways. And of course, no offense to the authors here, but I think that's pretty evident from the diagrams. On the face of it, these theories have some obvious truth, as nearly every human trait that we can think of plausibly exerts some effect on any other trait. However, despite being very useful for organizational and narrative or review purposes, I think that these qualitatively, kinds of grand coevolutionary theories provide a kind of qualitative, broad explanation that comes at the cost of failing to explain much of anything in particular about the specific traits which are featured within these theoretical frameworks. And this is partly because these holistic models are rarely used to actually generate testable, empirically tractable predictions about selection on or the evolution of specific phenotypes, due to our relatively limited knowledge about the directionality of these coevolutionary effects. And however, while we do know that these traits are indeed all present in humans and probably were in ancestral humans, at least within the last couple 100,000 years, we know that these traits can also evolve independently across taxa or integrate into distinctive clusters in different lineages. And we know that many of these traits also vary semi-independently across human societies. For example, we see independent variation in reliance on meat, the role of fathers or grandmothers in offspring care, and the structure of male and female social bonds. So these are not necessarily always co-occurring or necessarily evolving or plastically changing together. And so I think comparative approaches play a key role here in developing predictions about specific conditions under which these traits may or may not co-evolve, as well as in actually testing some of the putative directional effects that often feature in these theories, but are rarely tested empirically. On the other side of things are what we might call prime mover theories. And these take, I think, the exact opposite tactic and try to explain grand coevolutionary processes, not as being a process of everything explaining everything, but rather as being sparked by the evolution of a single specific trait, which is assumed to have an exceptional role in explaining human sociality. So for example, many theories have posited that language, culture, social emotions, and various other traits are what, quote, make us human. And one of the greatest risks, I think, of these models is that once we have explained something about a particular phenomena of interest, it's very easy to follow a slippery slope into then arguing that all of the other phenomena which are related to this trait are explained by the fact that this trait has its particular effect. So in some papers, you might read that, for example, following the evolution of language or the evolution of basic cultural capacities, etc., all of the other traits then very straightforwardly co-evolved with that trait to explain how we got here today. And in this regard, I think that while distinct in certain regards, these two approaches are not very far apart because they both prioritize human uniqueness and broad human-specific phenotypes over generalizable comparative approaches to specific phenotypes which are observed across other taxa. And beyond the theoretical risks of these kind of approaches, I also think that the prime mover accounts in particular have an exceptionally bad empirical track record, as repeated claims about the uniqueness of specific human behaviors or psychological traits are repeatedly contradicted by comparative research across animals or non-human animals. And therefore, rather than assuming, as nicely stated by Michael Tomasello, that we need to look for some small difference that makes the big difference, I would argue instead that a better approach is to break these highly complex phenomena into their constituent parts and consider the interaction of social ecology and phylogeny and the evolution of these traits across both humans and other taxa. And so the interesting question from this perspective is thus, not whether humans are the only species to exhibit some particular trait or not, but rather to understand how each of these traits may evolve or co-evolve and interact to facilitate uniquely human forms of social behavior. And just to give an example of how I think comparative approaches are already starting to help in this regard and to facilitate further understanding of some very complex human phenotypes, I'd point to, for example, research on the evolution of language, which has demonstrated that many of the cognitive mechanisms that facilitate human language are widely observed across other primates and birds. And this research has not only helped us to qualify claims about the evolution of language as broadly defined, and to better understand the role of phylogenetic inheritance in explaining the presence of these traits in humans, but it's also helped us to actually identify in a more empirically tractable way the specific phenotypes which may be uniquely derived within the human lineage, and to direct research efforts to explaining why those traits in particular have evolved, such as a high reliance upon vocal learning, and various forms of semantic and syntactic processing that exhibit unique cognitive mechanisms in humans. Similar work is also now being done in the comparative study of emotions and empathy as well, showing that although some human-specific forms of empathy and social emotions are, of course, important proximate mechanisms for explaining human social behavior, most of these specific mechanisms underlying composite traits like empathy are widely distributed in other animals, and in some cases clearly have similar functions in terms of regulating social interactions. And finally, just to lead into my own work, which I'll spend the rest of the talk talking about, I've also been attempting to take a similar approach to thinking about what is often broadly called human cooperation or ultrasociality, which I think can give the misleading impression, as I think I've stated before, that all of these traits evolved simultaneously as one package. But of course, we know that each of the components of human hypercooperation, ranging from paternal and alloparental care to collaborative foraging and multi-level social structures, may each be subject to distinct selection pressures and may evolve independently, providing the opportunity for us to do comparative research on each of these traits individually and to try and link that work together to then understand why in our species in particular, these traits have come together in our lineage. So having hopefully established some broad conclusions about the importance of comparative approaches, I'd like to now discuss some of my own research and hopefully show how these principles can be applied in practice and potentially benefit future empirical studies as well. And broadly, my research career thus far has centered on contributing to what I like to call an integrative behavioral biology of human sociality. And I would characterize that as involving an interdisciplinary and comparative perspective to understand both proximate and ultimate mechanisms relevant to human social behavior. And for time constraints, I'm not going to be discussing some of my previous work on proximate mechanisms, sociality, and cooperation in non-human primates, which have provided evidence for conserved developmental processes relating personality, morphology, and social dominance in humans and bonobos, as well as evidence of common motivational and interpersonal mechanisms that facilitate cooperation in common marmosets and humans. However, although I won't go into detail about these results, I would be remiss if I didn't briefly mention the many mentors who helped me to get to where I am today, including the field primatologists Linda Marchant and Scott Suarez, who mentored me during my bachelor studies at Miami University, as well as comparative psychologists / cognitive biologists Thomas Buganyar, Jorg Maassen, and Sonja Koski, who have extensively supported me during my research career, as well as during my time as a research fellow at the University of Vienna and the University of Helsinki. And so since my beginning my master's studies at Emory University and now into my PhD work, I've become increasingly interested in not only studying non-human animals and non-human primates in particular to think about phylogenetically conserved or convergent traits within these lineages in relation to human evolution, but I've also become interested in using social evolutionary theory and results from other animal societies to begin explaining otherwise unaccounted for variation within and among human societies. And so for the rest of my time presenting, I'd like to talk with you about my recent work on the ecological drivers of alloparenting across human societies. And hopefully, if time permits, I'll briefly discuss some of my ongoing PhD work looking at social selection on niche specialization within a small-scale human society. So to understand the evolution of human sociality, it's important that we also understand some of the key properties of humans' evolved life history and our foraging niche, which have likely characterized most human societies for the vast majority of our recent evolutionary history, living in hunter-gatherer societies that were probably quite small in scale. And as all of us know, humans exhibit a very long developmental period during which we take many years to decades to acquire skills and competency that we need to procure food for ourselves, as well as to survive and thrive in our social environments. And if we take data on energetic consumption and production in small-scale non-industrialized societies as representative of what was likely the case for much of human recent human social evolution, we can see that human childcare and human children are essentially what we might think of as energy sinks. So if you see the green line on this graph for net production, it's showing you basically the difference between calories produced and consumed per day. And what you can see is that basically for the first 2 decades of life, human children and young adults are essentially only draining energy and caloric intake from others around them, rather than producing it and contributing either to their own food intake or to the food intake of others. And this is in stark contrast to what we see in other great apes, such as chimpanzees, who begin to produce food for themselves very early in life and are largely net positive producers already by sexual maturity. And if we look at where this switch to net positive production occurs around the 2nd to 3rd decade of life, we also see that this maps very nicely onto developmental curves for some of the central skills for our foraging niche, such as hunting, which recent studies integrating many results across a variety of human populations have shown that skills such as hunting often continue to increase up until the 3rd to 4th decade of life. So basically, individuals are still getting better at hunting and producing food for themselves all the way into their 30s and 40s, and it's taking a very long time, essentially, to acquire these skills. However, at the same time, despite the large energetic gains that come from engaging in a technical and specialized foraging niche where big game can be hunted with bows or spears or other technology, the overall failure rate that we see for hunting also remains quite high throughout the lifetime. So you can see, particularly in the 3rd to 6th decade of life, there's often essentially a coin flip of whether you're going to come back home with something to eat after going on a hunting expedition, which itself is very energetically costly. So in addition to not only being incredibly dependent for many decades, we also, even into adulthood, continue to face risks of energetic shortfalls from failed foraging attempts. Yet, despite this relatively slow and quite costly developmental trajectory, phylogenetic studies have demonstrated that humans also exhibit exceptionally short interbirth intervals, as well as exceptionally high birth mass as compared to other primates of similar litter and body mass. And this suggests that humans have evolved to produce quite large, costly children at a relatively fast pace, again, as compared to other primates. So for me and for many other researchers in evolutionary anthropology, this raises a fundamental question of where all of this energy is coming from. How are children developing in human societies, and how are mothers supporting such fast production of offspring? And we now have data on childcare to answer this question from a variety of societies. And first, here, so each column is showing you the percentage of direct childcare received by a child. We can see that, as is typical of other mammals, mothers are often engaging in at least half of the care that infants are receiving early in life. And perhaps surprisingly, we also see very low rates in many societies of father care, although there are important exceptions to this rule where fathers are contributing a great deal to infant development. And at the same time, especially as compared to fathers, we see that siblings and grandmothers are also crucial in contributing to offspring development, although again, grandmothers exhibit a less consistent pattern across societies. And this is consistent with a theory emphasizing the role of intergenerational transfers, as I mentioned before, in sustaining human life history, where grandparents are not only providing food and resources to their children, but also directing those resources towards their offspring, or the offspring of their offspring, which allows for some buffering to the parents of the energetic costs of those children. But despite this pattern, we also see that there also tend to be very high rates of alloparental care being directed towards infants from either very distally related or unrelated individuals across these societies. And so this raises the question of whether we should think about humans as being cooperative breeders, in which offspring care is more of a collective activity among many caregivers rather than principally the duty of mothers and fathers. And I think asking this question is a great example of some of the issues we run into when doing comparative research like this, in terms of our emphasis upon human uniqueness or our emphasis upon generalization. And although I would say that humans are cooperative breeders in a broad sense, many anthropologists have criticized the role of not only, have criticized not only the descriptive title of cooperative breeding as applied to humans, but have also just criticized the entire value of using comparative models of cooperative breeding to understand human alloparenting, irrespective of definitional disputes. So for example, Strassman and Kropti argue that when human stem families exhibit celibate helpers at the nest style care, we might want to describe those societies as cooperative breeding. But the term is in general a very poor fit to many human family systems. And Joan Silk has also recently argued that the form of cooperative breeding that we see in other non-human primates, such as callitrichid monkeys, but also other cooperatively breeding animals in general, are very, very distinct from the kinds of care we see in humans, and that this suggests that the selective factors are also likely to be quite different between these taxa, overall diminishing the value of comparative research and informing our understanding of why humans engage in such extensive alloparental care. And I think my favorite, sarcastically, recent example of this is a call that we not only drop the label cooperative breeding, but that we start referring to humans as practicing biocultural reproduction, whatever that means. So because of, I think in part because of this disconnect with the comparative literature and because of many of the clear evidence of the role of kin across societies in offspring care, much of the research within evolutionary anthropology on childcare and alloparenting has been directed at explaining the role of grandmothers and older siblings in particular in the evolution of human childcare. And this research has been crucial, I think, in descriptively understanding the distribution of care within these societies, as well as consistently demonstrating that these alloparents do play a key role in the care of infants. However, by solely focusing our attention on kin-directed care, what remains unexplained is why there is such variation in patterns of alloparental care across human societies. And it also remains unexplained why we also see consistent rates of alloparental care coming from distal and otherwise unrelated individuals within social groups. And I think that this disconnect and our failure to explain these questions reflects a broader disconnect with the non-human literature on cooperative breeding. And as I mentioned before, this disconnect is argued to be appropriate given what I would call a model of a prototypical cooperative breeder, which is typically the kind of cooperative breeder that researchers are contrasting humans with when making claims about the irrelevance of comparative research. And this prototypical cooperative breeder would be one with typically a single breeding pair, reproductive suppression, or failed reproduction leading to care, and often occurring in the context of territorial habitats with habitat saturation, where individuals are basically staying on high quality territories, hoping to inherit that territory rather than risking reproducing on their own in a saturated environment. And often these are small groups with very high levels of genetic relatedness. But I think fundamentally this argument fails because it emphasizes the categorization of species. For example, what should we call cooperative breeding, and how should we categorize prototypical versus rare exceptions to these cases, over explaining the different components that might vary between each of these cooperative or breeding taxa. And in particular, although it is the case that many cooperative breeders do exhibit this prototypical pattern, these correlations are not an evolutionary law or necessarily following from a single evolutionary trajectory or ecological pressure that applies to all taxa engaging in alloparental care. And indeed, we see that alloparental care and reproductive structure can evolve independently and do across different non-human animal societies. So for example, I already mentioned that Taiwan yehinas, but also superb starlings, we see species that engage in cooperative breeding in groups of relatively low relatedness, in relatively large groups, and in habitats that are not characterized by high quality competition for high quality territories or habitat saturation. And we also see many mammalian societies such as, mammalian species such as black-tailed prairie dogs, in which various kinds of alloparental care co-occur in the context of plural breeding. And so what I would argue is that our emphasis should not be on whether or not humans meet a potentially debatable definition of what cooperative breeding constitutes, but rather our attention should focus on whether alloparental care specifically, which is the phenomena that we want to explain in humans, can be explained by some of the patterns we do see in other cooperatively breeding societies. And so in our work to address this question, we drew upon some of the recent large-scale comparative studies that have been done on cooperative breeding across avian taxa, as well as across mammals, which have consistently shown relationships between environmental harshness and higher rates of alloparental care, as well as some nice recent work showing similar transitions in rodents to sociality in the context of harsh conditions. And this work has led to the development of a theory to integrate what's been called the paradox of environmental quality and sociality, showing that rather than contradicting previous studies emphasizing competition for territories and habitat saturation. These may simply represent two distinct eco-evolutionary trajectories that species may evolve common forms of alloparental care in response to, but which may facilitate very different kinds of social organization. And in addition, many studies have also shown that not only do these patterns occur across taxa, but we also see evidence of plasticity in alloparenting within a variety of species. And some very elegant experiments, particularly in birds, have shown evidence of changing from cooperative to non-cooperative breeding in response to environmental change. And it's been argued that when these environmental conditions, such as environmental harshness or environmental saturation, are fluctuating, or sorry, habitat saturation are fluctuating over time within the context of an individual's lifetime, this can select for behavioral flexibility to optimize trade-offs between self-maintenance, reproductive effort, and potentially cooperative offspring care. And interestingly, although largely disconnected from this research, similar conclusions have been reached by paleoanthropologists trying to understand the role of climate change in driving the evolution of human morphology and social behavior. And we can see a very nice temporal co-occurrence of the onset of higher rates of environmental variability in the fossil record with evidence in the fossil record of the onset of various cooperative behaviors and related to foraging and dietary expansion, as well as some of the morphological changes we see in brain and body size, and cultural evidence of prolonged life history and the use of shelters and more complex tools, etc. So what this research has argued, I think very congruently with the comparative research, although largely disconnected from it, is that extreme variable climates, such as those that characterize the Pleistocene during which early Homo evolved, may have served as a selection pressure for increased behavioral plasticity and social learning, as well as increased mutual dependence and cooperative behavior. So in the paper that shared with my talk, which formed the bulk of my master's thesis, I investigated how environmental harshness might explain plasticity and alloparenting across human societies, pulling both on previous paleoanthropological evidence and that research across other cooperatively breeding taxa. And we had two hypotheses that we investigated in our study. The first was our first hypothesis was that societies in harsh environments would exhibit higher rates of alloparental care. And we made this prediction based on previous ecological theoretical models, which suggests that individuals might be able to overcome their shared ecological challenges in these harsh environments by pooling risk and engaging in cooperative childcare. But we also predicted that if this plasticity reflects responsiveness towards the costs and benefits of cooperation in different environments, that increased costs of cooperation should also lead to reduced rates of alloparental care. And we investigated this specifically by looking at observed rates of starvation across societies. And we expected that societies with high rates of starvation would have lower rates of alloparental care because of the prohibitive energetic costs of investing in others' reproduction when an individual is not able to sustain their own growth and reproduction. So, of course, it's quite difficult to ask these kinds of questions given the difficulty of collecting long-term data on human societies. But fortunately, for researchers like me and many other anthropologists, there have been a growth of databases such as the standard cross-cultural sample, which we used in our study, which integrate a variety of anthropological studies across the last century to provide a systematic record of variation in cultural, environmental, linguistic, and behavioral patterns across a variety of non-industrialized human societies. And in particular, the SCCS was developed as one of the first to do so, first integrated databases by George Peter Murdoch. And within this database, there are thousands of variables now across nearly 200 societies, where experts have independently and reliably coded various aspects, variation in these societies using both ethnographic and historical records. And recently, DPlace, or the database of places, language, culture, and environment, has been developed to supplement these cultural and behavioral variables with extensive geographic, climatic, and ecological data based on satellite studies and other recent global ecological research. So in our research, we relied on a sample of 141 non-industrialized societies. And particularly, we used these 141 societies because there was measures of both allomaternal, that is, care from individuals other than mother, as well as specific measures of paternal care. And because the anthropologists that compiled this database weren't specifically interested in addressing alloparental care, they have these two overlapping measures. And so to specifically address alloparental care, we controlled for father care in all of our analyses, so that we could look at effects on allomaternal care independently of the effects of fathers. And this was not only important for getting a more robust measure of alloparental care, but also to avoid bias due to potentially distinct selection pressures on fathers and alloparents, as has recently been demonstrated across mammalian cooperative breeders. And also, it's important, since we've been talking so much about data quality in the seminar, to emphasize that we took what was originally an ordinal scale, as you can see here, ranging from almost exclusively mother to mother minimal except for nursing. And we bend this into a measure of relatively low blue bars, or relatively high care. And that's defined relative to the scale across human societies, rather than some objective criteria of low or highness across all cooperatively breeding species. And the reason that we made this choice to bin our measure was fundamentally pragmatic and statistical. Given that there are such low counts for many of the extreme categories on the scale, it's likely that there's some measurement error in some of these categorizations. And it's also the case that for some societies, for example, early Roman societies, some of the records we have are biased by particular classes, or basically are not potentially giving us a representative view of that society as a whole. And so by binning our measure, we hope to get a more robust, generalizable assessment of factors that influence transitions from relatively low to relatively high forms of care, rather than emphasizing the estimation of transitions between each of these somewhat arbitrary categories on the scale. And also, this procedure does not influence our main findings. So if you're interested in that, please see the supplement of the paper. So despite having this great sample, we did face a problem which all cross-cultural and in general all comparative research faces, which is that societies are not independent data points. And this point was first raised by Francis Galton, and therefore is called Galton's problem. And the basic issue is that if we see correlations across societies, it might be a convergent response to shared socio-ecological factors, but it could just be genetic or cultural diffusion due to population history. And I think that should be self-explanatory, given that we're all biologists. But if we just observe a bunch of cultures and treat them as independent data points, we don't know the degree to which autocorrelation is biasing our estimates. And recent studies have shown that this is an important source of bias for many traits which have been studied cross-culturally for decades, such as polygyny, where studies integrating many explanatory factors which have been thought to be crucial for explaining variation in polygyny still explain only half, if not less, of the variance that cultural history does as explained by phylogeny. So fortunately, we were able to overcome this problem in our study by using a phylogeny of the SCCS. And I'm just going to breeze through here for time because I realize I'm running a little tight here. But my colleague Pavel Duda has developed a phylogeny using both genetic and linguistic data that allows us to control for population history including both genetic and cultural similarity in our analyses so that we can get a better measure of ecological effects. And so we used a variety of ecological measures on temperature and precipitation, and we used phylogenetic PCA to reduce them into 3 dimensions: temperature, precipitation, and starvation. And because of missing data and starvation and the starvation measures, we did these components separately. And we also controlled for a variety of other factors that we thought might be relevant based on previous studies. And we used Bayesian multi-level phylogenetic models for our analyses. This allowed us to examine linear and nonlinear interactions among these components, because we expected harsh environments would not only be lower in temperature or precipitation, but would be characterized by both extreme and unpredictable climates, including unpredictable temperature and unpredictable precipitation. And we used multiple imputation to account for our missing starvation scores, as well as regularizing priors, which allowed us to engage in more conservative inference. So just to briefly summarize the results, we found a strong nonlinear interaction between temperature and precipitation, such that societies which were specifically in context of both low temperature and low precipitation exhibited the highest probability of high alloparental care. Whereas societies that were just low in temperature but higher in precipitation exhibited a very weak and nonlinear effect. And so this is consistent with our prediction that low temperature and precipitation climate predictability are both contributing to variation in alloparental care. And just a quick note, we found that these PC scores are consistent with some previous studies which have focused on biomes rather than continuous measures. We found that many of these societies were in desert environments, savannas, and dry woodlands and shrublands. And we also found support for our prediction for starvation with a moderate negative effect, independently of our climate effects. Yeah, and then you can just see the predictions here summarized, but I'll skip that for time. So overall, we find clear support for our hypotheses, suggesting adaptive plasticity in human alloparental care. This is not only consistent with paleoanthropological evidence, but is also consistent with empirical patterns and other cooperative breeders, which we argue suggests that convergent social evolutionary processes may explain both interspecific and interspecific variation in alloparental care. And so just to sum up, I'll stop here because the rest is just kind of a future work anyway. So maybe we can talk about that in the discussion. But I think the kind of one sentence summary of our findings is that common ecological threats, such as harsh environments, can enhance the benefits of cooperative childcare if reciprocity or collective action can offset the risks and costs of care. So we see these contrasting effects of starvation and the climate, suggesting that individual behavior is responding plastically to the way that the environment influences the fitness, costs, and benefits of alloparenting. And I think with that, I'll just stop here. So thank you very much for your attention, and my apologies for going over a few minutes here.
Yes, thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. I have to say, I'm not a fan of the killer argument culture, and because of this, we cannot explain anything in humans with regards to evolution and environment. And also the point that some people make that humans are not a good model to test evolutionary theory. On the other hand, would of course also mean that what people like me, and I know Eduardo often write in their proposals, we want to understand animals to better understand humans, would then also not be valid if they're so special. Now, for everyone, I would like to if you participate in the discussion, to please switch on your video, because we want to be social here. We want to see who you are. Then type a question mark into the chat function, like always, and then I will see who has a question, and you will also kind of see where you are in line when you will be next. And last but not least, when I call you up that you can now ask your question, please still introduce yourself very quickly, saying your name and where you're coming from. There are no questions yet, so I can ask one question. At the end, you were a little bit fast. With the tree that you put on to control for something like phylogeny in your human study, if I understood this right, the tree was a combination of cultural similarity and genetic similarity. Is that right?
Right. So the tree is a super tree. Obviously, we don't have a single genetic study or linguistic study which has covered all of the societies in the SCCS. So it's a statistical aggregation of many independent trees. And importantly, the structure of the tree is constrained topologically by linguistic data. So in cases where genetic data isn't available, the place in the tree is being inferred by linguistic inference. And in our model, as any kind of classical phylogenetic, PGLS model, we're basically just assuming a Brownian motion process of diffusion. And so whether that similarity reflects genetic effects per se or cultural effects per se, we can't really disentangle. But what I would say is that the maximal distance between most of the societies in the sample is less than 10,000 years, or between 10,000 and 20,000 years when those societies split. And so just on basic principles, I would argue it's very unlikely that a complex behavior like alloparental care could be explained by genetic evolution independently in each of those societies. But so I tend to just treat that effect as a cultural effect. But of course, we can't really account for borrowing and other kinds of diffusion processes which wouldn't conform to a kind of classical phylogenetic model. So that is a limitation of the assumptions of the model.
Yeah, I mean, I was more thinking in the way, if it's not genetic relatedness, but a cultural tree, then it would really be a good way to test what is the influence of culture as a kind of cofactor here, to argue against the argument, oh, it's all culture. If you can control for the cultural similarity, then you can control for it. Did you say what was the effect? What was the importance of the tree in your variable? Was it not? I think it wasn't important at all. So there was no evidence that culture plays a big role from your study.
Yeah, so I didn't. We didn't really emphasize it too much in the paper, but in the supplement, you can see the standardized variance of the phylogenetic effect is exceptionally small. And this is partly due to the fact that we used conservative priors in our model, and it's a small sample, and so the inference of the phylogenetic signal is a bit uncertain. But overall, we can say, in comparison to other studies on traits like, for example, polygyny or other kinds of marriage practices, that there is much less of a phylogenetic signal on alloparental care specifically, as compared to other traits that are measured in the SCCS. So yeah, I don't think that I could confidently say like, this is a measure of culture, because essentially, we're just using linguistic and genetic data to kind of proxy that. Of course, you'd want to measure specific, aspects of what you mean by culture to look at the effect of those variables. But if you think about, language is probably a good proxy for how much two populations are sharing culture, then I think you could interpret that as evidence that culturally conserved alloparental care practices are less important in explaining variation than responsiveness towards local ecological conditions, just given the effect sizes in our model anyway.
I mean, by the nature of your data, I assume it was not possible to have two populations of the same culture.
Yeah, I mean, you would have to kind of debate about what you define as a culture, but yes, although the sample itself was originally selected, prior to the availability of this kind of widespread genetic and linguistic data, it was selected specifically to reduce the cultural similarity between the societies to facilitate research like ours. So back in the 60s, the goal was, let's pick as many representative but distally related societies as we can. So already, already we don't expect for there to be a high degree of cultural similarity in the sample, but there is evidence for some of the traits that's still a bias that you have to avoid in doing these analyses.
Okay, I have one more question before Aaron can ask his question. You were bringing up the standard cross-cultural sample, which I already heard about when I was a PhD student, and I know that social anthropologists also fight a lot with each other. And here in biology, we have many different databases. Can you say something about how commonly accepted the SCCS is in cultural anthropology, or whether there's a lot of debate whether this is appropriate or whether there are problems, or whether is it really something where they were sitting together and they agreed, okay, it all makes sense?
So yeah, I think there's two ways to answer that question. I would say that in general, comparative research is very out of fashion in sociocultural anthropology in the strict sense, particularly I guess in American or I guess European as well universities. There's a lot of division, between the biological and the cultural side often, and I think there's a general concern that by focusing on these kind of higher level top-down categories that we're missing a lot of the unique richness of any particular culture. I would say though that among evolutionary anthropologists and more biologically minded cultural anthropologists that these databases are widely accepted and are consistently used in research on a variety of topics beyond just alloparental care, but also just to understand even within just for human sake to understand the coevolution of cultural institutions. And yeah, there's some really great data I think that has come out of this work showing how humans flexibly respond, not only behaviorally, but also in terms of social norms to things like natural disasters or risks of shortfalls, and even things like my colleague Eric Ringen, for example, some of his research showed with SCCS that the availability of food storage led to reduced rates of daily food sharing. And so they argued that that was consistent, with basically you need to be mutually dependent when you can't store your food because your food will go bad anyway. But when you have food storage, you can share with yourself in the future. And so you don't need to rely on cooperative networks as much. And so I think a lot of important testing of basic principles of evolutionary ecology is coming out of this work. But certainly if you asked a cultural anthropologist, they might give you a very different answer than what I just said. So take that as it is, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Then Aaron, if you ask your question, please.
Sure. Aaron Sandell here from University of Texas at Austin. That was a really interesting talk. There's so many different sort of sparks that had in different directions. One question I have is sort of related to relatedness, kinship, and thinking about parental care. And you talked a little bit about this in looking at the cross-cultural sample, in how you separate maternal versus paternal, or whether you lump or split that as parental care. I think I might have missed something with whether you were lumping or splitting it, but I wonder if you could speak to sort of the different expectations we have about whether a species is likely to exhibit maternal care, paternal care, or other forms of care among different individuals, related or otherwise. Because I think we have certain assumptions. For example, in mammals, it's sort of assumed that we're going to see some form of maternal care. And I think that assumption comes from the fact that it's so widespread. It's just we actually see it, and it makes
Right.
sense since there's the genetic relatedness. But we almost don't, on the one hand, don't expect necessarily paternal care, but then in humans we sort of do, given that even though you showed that it's variable, we sort of, at least in a lot of the societies where scientists are coming from, there is a lot of paternal care. And the fact that they're genetically so related, often you might assume equally that they would care as would a mother. So I'm just trying to, but on the other hand, you don't see it. So I wonder if you could speak a little to what are the sort of assumptions or biases you might have going in, and how we even frame things like parental care, and to what extent is parent an appropriate biological term?
Well, I think you asked a bunch of really interesting questions. I don't think I can answer all of them, but maybe a few points to what you said. So it's definitely a good point that, you know, how much we should expect different selection pressures to act on, you know, dads, moms, and other alloparents is something I have to think about very closely when doing these kind of comparative studies. And in our study, it was actually an issue I ran into because much of the research in anthropology has emphasized allomaternal care specifically, where father care and care from non-fathers or, you know, anyone other than the father is being lumped together. And like you said, that is partly due to the fact that that's kind of the prototypical mammalian pattern is moms investing primarily. But I think now from some of the recent comparative studies, we know that there might be different, not only causes, but also consequences of father care versus care from others. So for example, I know that Sandra Heldstab just had a paper come out last year in behavioral ecology and sociobiology, where they looked at a large sample of mammals and they showed that the evolution of brain size was specifically related to male help in offspring care, whereas, you know, alloparental help was related to, I think, higher fertility. And so in our study, we knew from some previous work, as well as some exploratory analyses that we report in the supplement, that father care is also responding potentially differently to ecological pressures across human society. So you actually see some evidence for father care increasing in societies where you have greater resource availability. And I think this is consistent with the theory on human pair bonding and the evolution of father care in anthropology, which emphasizes the evolution of collaborative foraging and specifically cooperative hunting and facilitating capture of huge energetic surplus through, you know, a giant carcass that you can't eat all by yourself. Or even among the male hunters, presumably that you capture that prey with. And so it's been argued that that has facilitated the evolution of fathers investing in offspring, because essentially you have a situation where men have all this extra meat that they can share with females as a source of energetic investment in their offspring. You asked a lot of really good questions in there, but I would say, I guess, as a general point, that I think it's always important to think about, you know, not only just sex differences and driving fundamental variation we see in males and females and offspring care, but also the costs and benefits that might differ across ecological contexts as a function of who's helping and why they're helping. So yeah, hopefully that's not a too broad of an answer that it's useless, but that's, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that was a difficult question, of course. I mean, all these data sets from these different human cultures come from many decades and different research histories. I can just say, when I worked on paternal care some decades ago, everybody believed there's nearly no paternal care on humans, so it's not normal. And this point also changed. So then the next question is from Michael Taborski.
Yes, thank you very much for this interesting talk. What I found particularly intriguing is your comparative analysis of the effect of environmental features on social parameters like alloparental care. What I would like to ask is, we know from cooperatively breeding fish that one particular environmental factor is primarily important, that is apparently predation pressure. And I wonder whether you have any evidence that in human history, predation pressure might have been important also for the evolution of sociality and alloparental care, or whether there is sufficient variation in extant human populations in predation risk, if there is any, to explain some of the variation in social patterns.
That is a great question, and one I've actually been thinking about recently. I think to front load my response, I'll say that I don't have an empirically exciting answer. I think we don't have that data, but there are some interesting threads, I think, that tie in predation pressure to some of the interesting social behaviors we see, particularly in small scale societies. So actually some recent work on sleep, surprisingly, has focused on basically how our sleeping patterns, our prototypical sleeping patterns in the West are, or I should just say in industrialized societies generally, are quite exceptionally weird in the way that we sleep all through the night, and we often sleep in very quiet environments. And some recent studies with foragers have shown that actually individuals are often engaging in what's been called sentinel-like behavior, where you have individuals basically sleeping and awaking at different times of the night consistently throughout the entire night. So you have some individuals who are awake from 2 to 3, from 4 to 6, from, so on. And so it's not everyone keeping basically a 9 to 12 or whatever schedule, but you actually have always some individuals awake, watching and listening to what's going on. And there's definitely not clear empirical data which shows this functions in any way as a means of reducing predation pressure. But from an ethnographic perspective, there are some really cool examples, for example, in some of these societies where you see paintings and artwork that's reflecting on basically the risk of large predators at night and the importance of staying awake and listening. And so some anthropologists are, I think, becoming increasingly interested in how this sentinel behavior might relate to predation. But, to be honest, I just don't think that there is any kind of good quantitative data that I could, or others could currently ask that question. But it still remains a debate within evolutionary anthropology, the degree to which humans were scavengers versus, active hunters. So if scavenging was more important than some believe it is in explaining the evolution of human sociality, then I would think, that predation pressure would then also be an important factor in explaining how that scavenging niche was influencing human sociality. But yeah, it's a great question. I just don't think we have enough data now. I guess from what I've read, that's consistent with some of the issues we have in testing this in non-human primates as well, where you have basically adaptations that you think are functioning to dramatically reduce the risk of predation pressure. And, if that's true, then it's consistent with the fact that we so rarely actually observe predation events that we can directly quantify. And maybe other primatologists want to comment on that, but I think that is just a general issue we have in terms of actually directly measuring predation and actually seeing the predation happening, not just inferring it from infants going missing and things like that.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, interesting. I have an unpublished master thesis where striped mice sleeping at night, there's always somebody awake, which we interpret as somebody is always available to warn the group from a predator. So now I can write in the next round proposal again how similar they are to humans. And important to understand human evolution. So the next question comes by Kaya Tombak, please.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I have a question about your graph of net energy contributions for children. And I was wondering whether alloparental care by siblings was built into the energy contributions, and also whether there were any sex differences in that curve. Because I'd be surprised if one sex were not cheaper to produce, given that there are often strong gender roles across societies that are, that can go in the similar directions across cultures.
Thanks for your questions. So your first question was about whether sibling care is integrated into that curve. I would say that in general, at least within the anthropological literature, the evidence suggests that the most important forms of sibling care are what are often called, quote unquote, low cost forms of care. So for example, in many societies, we see that siblings play a crucial role in just watching infants. So moms can actually engage in foraging or can go off and do other things with their time. And so a lot of the kind of care that is quantified is essentially low-cost indirect care of just kind of integrating your sibling into the activities you're already doing. You might be carrying your sibling while you're foraging. There's certainly evidence that children are being fed by their older siblings, but I think that as an important factor in the evolutionary history of humans would be more debatable, because a lot of that has to do with the subsistence mode of a particular society. So like if you're engaged in some kind of keeping of domesticated animals or horticulture, then it might be more readily easy for you to actually actively produce some kind of food or output that you can just directly give to your sibling through your own labor. But yeah, most of the care is pretty low cost. And then your other question was about sex differences. And in the graph that I showed, it's just about caloric production. So it's just, did you produce food and how much food was fed to you on average? There aren't stark sex differences in those curves that would really stand out to you. But I think that's a good point that, you're right that there might be different energetic investments that are made in males or females. And at least from the cultural side of things, we do know that there are strong sex biases. I mean, obviously, in the West, we might think about like, a bias towards males socially, at least. But there's also opposite patterns of biases against males in some cultures. But again, I think I wouldn't be confident to disentangle that from the sociocultural context and to give you a confident answer, but it's a good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just to remind everyone, even though in the meantime we know each other quite well, there's always new people. So when you speak, then please also quickly say where you're coming from, that we have some information who you are. And the next one I know very well, Eduardo, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Jordan. I'm Eduardo Fernandez Duque, trained as a biologist, then primatologist, and as of late, anthropology. So I'm really trying to take in everything you've shared with us, Jordan. Thanks. It's very brave of you to walk us through such a range of topics and questions and different kinds of data. So I really appreciate it. As I was listening to your talk and then to the questions, my thoughts were continuing to go to some of the themes that have been a regular topic through the many seminars, and were a little bit also at the reasons for us getting together and developing the seminar. We've been talking a lot about natural history, right? The need to reposition the value of natural history. Another way of thinking of it would be kind of primary data. And also we talked a lot about some of the databases that people use for the study of non-human animals. So all these things, these two things are central to the interesting research you share with us. My main question is, do you see the value, or are you planning, or do you know of people who may take some of the findings from your study that is based on some of these databases that some of us have really raised serious issues about, and take a smaller set of human societies for which we actually have data that we can relate to, that we can explore for its quality, and test your findings now with a smaller set. You just made reference a few minutes ago about I don't know what the question was, but we do not have, you were saying how we do not have solid quantitative data. And I don't remember which variable it was that you were talking about, but that probably applies to a lot of the data we're using from the standard cross-cultural sample. We do not have quantitative data, or we don't know it, or I tried to track it down and I got lost. So if one were to take, and there's so many exciting ideas in what you've done, but would it be worth to say, okay, how does it play out if I test it with data that holds the standards of 2020? And I mean, that's what behavioral ecology of humans is. I mean, when the discipline took off in the 70s and 80s, we started really looking at humans very much like we look at primates or fish or reptiles, and really getting to know the subjects and developing studies well-designed where we could account for uncertainties. I have to say, I mean, I would be true to myself if I didn't say that. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see how all this plays out with data that we can examine for the data and not for the estimates and modeling and inference. I sometimes, I mean, this is, because you've been attending seminars, that we've said the same for some of the other studies doing these huge comparative studies. Would we get different answers if we did fewer in more depth?
Yeah, so I totally agree with you. I think this should not be the stopping block. I hope that my work has pushed some people in evolutionary anthropology to think about things like, for example, the climate, and also, more direct effects that the climate might have on things like, biodiversity and local resource availability, to try and think about those in a more comparative perspective, and to actually use, actual quantitative data on, foraging returns, rates of care, who's caring for whom at what times and for how long, etc. I would say that some of my colleagues, for example, Abigail Page, working with OCTA, have been doing really great long-term, quantitative field observation studies, trying to understand some of these patterns. And for example, her study, one of her studies on alloparental care in the OCTA was basically one of the first to show that a lot of the care was explained by reciprocity between very distally related kin, and wasn't just this kind of kin network that a lot of the past research had emphasized. And so we're still kind of in this baby step phase of just having one study that introduces an idea. But her and I have been talking, and with others as well, about using this as a launching point to then try to engage in some more integrative studies where we could try to get some, common measures that we could have across multiple societies. And some of that data is already there. So I unfortunately, I told myself to talk slow, and I talked way too slow. So I had a lot more at the end of my slide, at the end of my presentation about my PhD work. And I'm actually using some research on the Chamane, who are peoples that are horticulturalist foragers who live in Bolivia. And there's a long-term field project there that's been going on since 2002 that's collected basically thousands and thousands of hours of foraging data and activity data, et cetera. And we're actually using that now to build on this study to start looking at individual variation in care, and how that's related to or not related to specialization and other kinds of cooperative activities. So yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think that's just the exciting future. The SCCS has intrinsic limit. I mean, and I think an ordinal scale has intrinsic limitations no matter what, right? Like, we're using these qualitative categorical schemes, and we can debate about whether it should be binary or 6 points or 4 points. Ultimately, that's not a quantitative scale. And so I also would like to see just some real behavioral data coming to bear. But all I can say, I guess, is that is starting to happen. And I hope that I hope my study motivates other anthropologists to think about doing the same with their actual localized, on the ground, in-depth knowledge of their population. So yeah, but it's a great point.
Okay, thank you. Then the next question is by Susan Perry.
Hi, great talk. I'm a primatologist at UCLA. I work on capuchins. I think I missed your definition of alloparenting. Apologies if I wasn't paying close enough attention, but I was wondering whether knowledge transfer is part of your definition, or whether you're just using direct care, like providing nutrients or carrying or protection. Certainly for a species that has a complex foraging niche, and especially during rapidly changing environments, it's critical to acquire knowledge from others, and so especially from adults if the environment's stable, but maybe from younger individuals if those are the ones who are innovating more during times of rapid environmental change. And it occurred to me that having exposure to a really wide range of models for social learning might be critical during harsh conditions. And these social learning opportunities might be a side effect of being carried, or just tolerated in close proximity, or having a scrounging event. And I think that it's particularly important to take social learning benefits into account to explain the diversity of who is alloparenting during particular types of conditions. So I was wondering if there was enough information in the HRAF about who is either actively teaching or providing opportunities for certain kinds of observational learning.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So in terms of the definition, I mean, the way that the variable is coded that we use for our analysis is focusing more on direct forms of care, like this anthropologist in this society noted that, this cousin was carrying this infant, and that it was typical for cousins to carry that sort of thing. There is some very, very gross data on like who's carrying, and those data are basically like, is it mostly grandmas or is it others as well? So it's not very informative for the kind of detailed analysis that I think you have in mind. But I totally agree with you that information transfer is potentially a form of care. And I think this is maybe one area where human research has, potentially has benefits to feed back into animal research, where we have had to come up with novel ways to think about care in a broad sense. So for example, with father care, we see in many societies that there are trade-offs between things like investing in indirect care through caring for, say, domesticates that you can then give to your children when they're adults, which is obviously a very large form of energetic investment. But there's a trade-off between taking care of the infant directly and holding it and being out with your animals and taking care of them, right? So we actually see that in the SCCS, and in the supplement of our paper, we talk about it a little bit. So I think, yeah, if we wanted to do something very broad and integrative, certainly for teaching and social learning, we would definitely require the kind of data Eduardo was talking about, very localized on the ground data. But I think also there's been for a long time a bias within the human sciences to assume that there's very, very little direct teaching going on in foraging societies. And this is kind of surprising to people who aren't already engaged in these conversations, but there are very, very specific definitions of teaching and learning that people in psychology have developed, which when then applied to foraging societies are often leading to the conclusion that no teaching is happening, because often you see very, very, very little, or at least, on average, very little rates of very direct kind of pointing and saying, do this with that and let that happen. A lot of the parenting is a lot more, and not just parenting, but just kind of learning and teaching is a lot more indirect, like waiting for something bad to happen and then fixing it, or, various kinds of other care. So I think currently anthropologists are just trying to get the best measures of this in different societies to understand, how is teaching happening in ways that maybe to a Western person who grew up in a formal school system, they're not reading as teaching. But yeah, I don't know that the SCCS has anything that would directly get at what you're saying, but yeah, I totally agree. That's a form of care, especially in human societies where information is its own currency of, central value. So, and yeah, that we know that cultural evolution is not just happening vertically through parents and children, but a lot of it is happening horizontally and, obligately. So, certainly it's not just parents and close kin that are investing in teaching children things. So yeah.
Right. Well, I think it's not just about the teaching, but there's so many other forms of social learning,
Yes.
even for complex, just imitation in the absence of teaching. Even if you had data on who is associating with whom during particular kinds of activities that the adults are doing, that might be a good proxy for social learning opportunity.
I totally agree. I guess I was focusing on teaching because I was thinking about care, and I think it would be the easiest argument to make that that's care, because you could define it as like you're taking a cost to invest in the growth of the other, or provide a benefit to the other. But yeah, definitely in terms of social learning. So some of my colleagues are now working on that also with the Chimane data that I mentioned before, looking at specifically foraging behavior and basically seeing how variation in dietary habits over time, how much of that is being explained by parents, other kin, and then broader fiends and their social networks. So yeah, hopefully that kind of data will be coming out shortly, but it's just it's just hard to collect that long-term data.
Oh, yeah.
as it is in capuchins and lots of other primates. It's just hard to collect that data, but I think we're getting it now. So
cool. Yeah, I really liked to talk.
Thanks.
Thank you. Then the next question is from Miles.
Hi, thank you for the awesome talk. My name is Miles. I'm a master's student in Lauren Hayes' lab at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga in Tennessee. But I was reading over your latest publication with a couple of my lab mates, and we got into this heavy discussion really focusing in on cultural variation. I think we got a little bit too caught up in that, on how cultural variation can kind of influence the results that you've gotten. And now after your talk, I think that we were in our heads a little bit too much, and where kind of capturing all of that variation may have been the intent that you have. And I also apologize if maybe I've missed some things along the way of how you've described how you are using certain proxies to estimate variation. But it's kind of in that same mindset, I'm still curious of how culture may serve as like a covariate that could influence your results whenever looking at the plasticity in alloparental care, not just between two different societies, but temporally as well. So I know the SCCS database that you used ranged from, I don't know if all of the points that you pulled from that, but ranged from the 1800s to the mid 1900s. If that were to be updated into the 2000s as well, what kind of influence do you think that would play, the temporal change in a certain society and their culture? And then also, how could you maybe account for that?
Yeah, so, sorry, so your first question was about like how we accounted for culture and how culture might be a part of the response to the environmental change, right? So, yeah, so I guess I would say you make a good point that although we do, like I was mentioning to Carson's question, we do try to control for the diffusion signal you would expect for culture. Like if you just expected that, you know, over time there was a constant process of decreasing similarity between societies as a function of their cultural, you know, background, just like you would make the same assumption for, you know, genetic similarity over time between species. That's basically what we've done in our model. It's just kind of assumed this process, but that doesn't mean that we've somehow perfectly captured culture and like cut culture out of the model, right? Like that's just an assumption we've put in and we've tried our best to do. So what that means is that we're not, the result we see in a response to the environment is not being biased by the cultural clustering of the species, or sorry, of the societies in our sample. But that doesn't mean that cultural adaptation isn't part of that behavioral change. So, I mean, really what the model is controlling for is very, very slow kind of arbitrary drift-like change in culture. But if you think about culture as a series of mechanisms that presumably humans evolved because they had adaptive benefits, you know, independently of what we can now do with culture, given, you know, where we're at in the world today, then you would assume that part of that response, like I talked about, you know, from some of the paleoanthropological data, is to facilitate responses to rapid changing environments where genetic evolution just wouldn't be able to keep up, so to speak, or would take too long. And so in that regard, I mean, there's definitely nothing to say that, you know, societies aren't changing their cultural practices when the environment changes. And so the signal is basically just overlapping. But the behavioral ecologist in me wants to say that doesn't matter to the fact that it might still be an adaptive response, and that culture might be thought of as just one of many proximate mechanisms by which, you know, humans could get to an adaptive response in the environment. But I also think at a proximate level, it is really interesting to know at an individual level, you know, is it that each individual has mechanisms of plasticity where like I am, you know, I'm experiencing a prolonged period of uncertainty in, you know, in resource intake. And so I then start becoming more cooperative. Is it like that? Or is it like our entire group decides that, you know, over time that we all need to be more cooperative. And so I just adopt a social norm in this environment and I survive and reproduce because I'm a part of a group that has that norm. So our data certainly can't speak to that, but I think mechanistically, that's a very interesting question. And there's really just a lot of debate within cultural evolutionary research about, you know, how much we can actually take the end products and then backwards infer the process of getting there. I think it's a little easier with genetic data, although that's also becoming complicated increasingly by, you know, evidence of hybridization or, you know, otherwise, like I guess not so much in animals, but in other species where you have things like horizontal gene transfer and stuff. But with culture, that's just ubiquitous. It's not just diffusion, it's also borrowing and conquering and switching and melding and integrating. So there becomes a point with these big comparative data sets like this where it almost is like impossible to really address that question. So I think it's a really good one. And then I'm sorry, what was you had a second question, right?
You may have already sort of addressed it, but just within a society, how culture can change over time as well.
Yeah, so there have actually been some cool studies that we've done in our lab looking at really not published or in supplementary materials, not as primary studies, but looking at temporal effects in the SCCS to see if there are biases due to the times in which records were taken. So that's not exactly your question, that's more on the research end, but we don't see very much evidence of researcher bias due to the time in which the data was collected. But we do know, not from the SCCS, but just from ongoing research, that very rapidly a lot of these societies are changing as they come in contact with market economies. And, you know, basically, if you're in a foraging society and then suddenly there is a whole town next to you where you can get money and you can buy tobacco and buy Coke, I mean, that radically can change the culture of a society within even just a couple of years. So, for example, one of the papers I sent around was on looking at, you know, like I talked about, basically how individuals are plastically adjusting in response to group norms over time in the Hadza. And they've now looked, you know, basically from 10 years before to present, and have shown that just from interacting more and more with the market economy nearby, and basically researchers coming in, that already the stability of behavior over time and also the preferences that people have in picking partners are changing. And it's been argued that that has to do with basically encountering more strangers, non-closely bonded individuals, and starting to use heuristics like, how trustworthy do I think that person is? And basically forming these kind of personality trait like impressions of people that are then mediating partner choice. So yeah, culture can rapidly change. In terms of changing to the environment, we don't have as much data on that, but the social environment at least can radically shift the cultural landscape, so to speak. So that, I mean, that also then just accents my point that when we treat culture like a phylogeny, there are things we're going to miss, because that's not the only way that culture functions in human societies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Then we have another question by Aaron. Please, Aaron Sandel.
I put it in parentheses in case other people had questions, or I don't know if people were asking stuff on YouTube. But I was curious, thinking, you're discussing sort of proximate and ultimate explanations for human behavior and trying to integrate it with broader behavioral ecology. I think obviously that's a really useful task, and it's tricky for various reasons with humans. Thinking about Tinbergen's levels of explanation, I wonder if humans, or maybe there's another sort of level of explanation required when thinking about human and possibly other animal behavior, sort of related to culture, or maybe more like cognition, and what maybe it could fit within a mechanism, but it seems sort of different from the physiological, musculature mechanism that Tinbergen talks about. But to what extent do you think maybe we need to talk about a fifth level of explanation, which is what is the human thinking, which may or may not reflect, what we know about, say, genetic relatedness, or what we can assess as maybe an adaptive behavior, but why they think they're doing something. Should that maybe be a separate category? And to what extent do you think that could be useful to fill the gap between sort of our own folk understanding of what's going on versus these more behavioral ecological metrics of what's going on?
Yeah, so being trained in animal behavior and then coming into human behavior more directly, I hold tight to my Tinbergen, but I know, and I agree with you, that many people are beginning to emphasize, the potential importance of, not letting the dichotomy between proximate and ultimate levels of explanation stop us from developing more integrative explanations that might, account for constraints, as well as feedback processes due to cultural evolution, which we aren't going to neatly partition easily into proximate and ultimate explanations. And I think, some of the extended evolutionary synthesis stuff has been pushing, forward in that regard. Particularly Kevin Leyland has argued that, we should kind of abandon that framework. But yeah, I would say that we, again, like kind of with human exceptionalism, I think that it's a slippery slope to too easily let go of what have historically been shown to be very reliably valuable intellectual heuristics for separating potentially congruent explanations of the same phenomena. And so with human research as well, I think there are many examples where we do see the utility of that distinction. For example, there are some really nice human behavioral ecology studies where, you ask people why they're doing something, or even I again, like to a question earlier about like sex preferences, you sometimes see that the behavior of what people are doing is completely in contradiction to what they're saying. And that, if you assume that people are saying what they actually believe, then, you can think about like you might be engaging in an adaptive behavior response, but your proximate conscious understanding might have nothing to do with the, ultimate explanation for that adaptive behavior. But at the same time, of course, human agents do actively construct, do and plan and change their environments at that level of, I guess, agency. So I don't know that I would say I think it needs another level, although I think that's an interesting idea. I guess I would say I think we should try our best to see where that works, and if it fails in certain areas, then it fails, and then we have to give more in-depth, integrative, mechanistic, and ecological explanations. But there are even instances, with cultural evolution where that becomes useful, where you can think about like similar cultural responses, like increased food sharing norms, but what those norms look like in terms of the way people talk about them or the way they enforce them might be totally different. And so you could also think about like the proximate level of culture and the ultimate level of culture intergenerationally. And I don't know, I don't do that work, so I'm not sure, how useful that would be. But yeah, I mean, certainly there are edge cases where that way of thinking will break down. So yeah.
I guess part of it is it's not just what the person thinks they're doing. It could be a combination. In a way, I think anthropology and psychology are filling that category. It's what do people think they're doing, which I think is still useful for understanding their behavior. But like you're saying, why they might be doing it using observational studies or experimental studies to try to actually get at, like what Malinowski in his early cultural anthropology studies called the imponderabilia. It's like the things that humans can articulate, but they're probably still behaving in that way. But it's, even though it's focused on humans, I think thinking about cognition as another mechanism, it doesn't seem to fit in with like, it would still be a proximate maybe mechanism, but it wouldn't be so, it wouldn't be, it's not development and it's not like physiology or genetics. I mean, it seems like its own, that's why I'm thinking maybe there's its own category, because you could apply to other animals. You do a cognitive study and you say, why does the animal, respond this way? That might, I don't know to what extent maybe cognition already is integrated into how people explain things. But it also, I think it has a special value because we are humans. By acknowledging that level, we also can maybe connect to our own biases when we enter these studies.
Yeah, I think I maybe misunderstood your point. So I appreciate that you clarified it now, because so I definitely agree with you that there are some interesting aspects of cognition, which, at least if we just take Tinbergen fully literally at his original specification, would not obviously fit into the kind of physiological mechanistic basis that is often lumped as the proximate causation. And I know some people have proposed treating cognition as another level in the explanatory framework. I guess for me though, I think that also becomes a slippery slope, because you might say, well, like cognition is distinct from neurophysiology and particularly important ways where you might have like different underlying neurophysiological mechanisms, but the same cognitive mechanism. And so those levels should be separated so that we don't make that confusion. But I also think that kind of argument goes further down. Like you could also say like certain kinds of, brain systems have like a common function, but if you look at the like neuronal activity at a second by second level, then like it's going to be different, bundles of neurons that are going to fire in any particular action for any particular individual. And so I guess for me, I would start by saying, I think about cognition as part of the proximate mechanisms by which animals respond to the environment, including humans. And I would maybe be more prone to just maybe colorfully interpreting Tinbergen and thinking about that as part of what was meant in the first place by proximate mechanisms. But yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, I think cognition definitely deserves its own study, and is clearly something comparatively that is important for explaining animal behavior. So yeah, and it's certainly what I meant too when I was talking about proximate explanations.
Thank you. There are no other questions in the chat, and just as some people asked directly, indirectly, I've been also monitoring the YouTube channel. There haven't been questions there, but maybe I can then ask myself another question, which you might regard as quite critical, but I see it more with regards to, the entire SCCS database and your study in particular, because I would have loved to have this database available very nicely online. When I was a PhD student, and it was very difficult to get hold of. I mean, you can see it here. I think that is basically the score you have been using. And for example, when we look, my question is, how often do people, or I don't even know who is putting this together. Is there anything like data quality check and updating data? Some people putting in new results, like when we go here for the society with minimal mother care except nursing, we find it is the ancient Romans. And I know that, of course, I mean, even research on the ancient Romans has developed a lot over the last years. I mean, there's still many people working on it. And when I try to, how does one find the...
If you go back, you can see the original publication where the codes are published at the top. So if you scroll up on the far right, you'll see Barry and Paxson. So at the bottom of that description is a citation, and that paper explains in detail the coding process. It also explains how they independently coded the records, and then also reports reliability indices that you would expect for any kind of a human rater study, basically demonstrating reliability for the measures. But to your point about updating, there are measures that are updated over time. For example, like we get new data on foraging practices for some of the societies, and people put in new data. I'm not sure, no one has updated this data since the original publication.
So these are all data from 1971 and studies done before.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, the thing is that it would be very difficult because much of the data is coming from anthropologists who did extensive research at a particular window in time, where many of these societies now, like we were talking about a moment ago, are not going to be in anything like the same socio-ecological context, not just in terms of where they're living, but like the technology available to them. There's going to be a lot of cultural change that is going to have happened since these records were taken. That would make it very difficult to do anything but just add another reliable coder into the records that we already have. So that is definitely a limitation, but it's also just a necessary limitation of studying humans who change so rapidly over time, as opposed to a species where you could come back 100 years later and the environment might be the same and they might be doing the exact same thing. It's just not like that for most of the societies in the SCCS. But yes, I mean, for the Romans in that particular example, that was part of why we also bend the measure, because it's not so important to us whether it was accurate for them to give them a 5 or a 6. The point is just that records indicate that there was extensive alloparenting that is high relative to other societies, and so that was part of our rationale also for bending the measure, was just to aggregate out some of the measurement error we expect in those particular bends. Okay, but I mean, I think it just comes back to Eduardo's point too, that we do need more quantitative data.
So all the research in the Amazon over the last 50 years and also on some of the Kungsan could not be considered. Okay, I wasn't aware of that. Okay, yeah, I mean, for me, it's a little bit of pity. I mean, you guys are yourself doing research in the Amazon, isn't it? That these data, yeah, but I don't know.
Well, no, it's a good point. I mean, I guess in theory, we could add to the sample, right? But then you have these issues of like, we would then need to develop more new phylogenies. And I think you'd have to then do like more extensive data protocols. But that shouldn't stop us from doing that. So, I mean, that's a good point. I think what's basically happened, like I said, is that a lot of this research has fallen out of favor in anthropology, and many, human behavioral ecologists are few and far between. So the data is accumulating, but it's not accumulating fast. And if you want to do a big comparative study with 100 plus societies, these kind of databases are going to be your best bet. But I agree with you that it would be very helpful if people made efforts to try and integrate codes from more recent projects. So that's a great point. And I know some of the people that are involved in maintaining these databases online. So that's something I'd like to talk with them about. It's a good point.
Okay, let me check. I've lost the chat function. Here is yeah, there is now a question by Tim. Tim, please.
Tim Glenbrook, Cambridge, primates through onto long-term studies of deer and meerkats and now mole rats. The opening part of your talk took me back a long time to where I was present at the start of the human sciences course at Oxford, and they brought in the social anthropologists and they came in and the sociologists, and they sat down one side of the room and the zoologists and the biologists sat down the other, and they were charged with producing a course that would link the two together and bring a perspective on both sides to the students who took it. And they sat down sequentially for many days and they couldn't find almost any common ground at all. The first part of your talk reminded me of how extensive the differences between cultural anthropology and biological sciences and the human sciences, and how damaging it is to both sides. And my impression, perhaps obviously a bias, is that the behavioral scientists and the biological anthropologists are going really quite a long way and developing into areas where there should be a conjunction with the cultural anthropologists. But it still isn't there. It's a great shame. How do we heal it?
Well, I totally agree with you. It is a shame. Unfortunately, I don't have a great answer about how we heal it. I would say that as a early career researcher, my attitude has been more, I know what I think and I'm kind of following my path with people that agree with me. And so to some degree, I've had a bit of a negative attitude intellectually with some of my colleagues who I otherwise, very much like in terms of kind of these debates that we can't get past about, evolutionary approaches to human behavior and comparative research. And yeah, I think cultural anthropology as a discipline is still really changing a lot. And there's a lot of people in cultural anthropology now who, they're doing the kind of research where they're going out to, businesses like a company in America, and they're doing studies on, how people are getting along and their relationships. Very, very detailed, localized, qualitative research that is hard to find its relationship back to these broad evolutionary questions. But I think there are a lot of cultural anthropologists that are in interdisciplinary departments who are, particularly people who study hunter-gatherers, who are still trying to maintain that connection. The hard thing for me is that there's been so many different ways it's been tried. Like in America, there are so many institutions that tried for a 4-field approach where you had biological, linguistic and cultural anthropology and forensic anthropology, everything being brought together. And many of those departments have now split. So there was so much strife that people just decided, let's just not be together at all. And let's just get separate funding and separate, everything. And that's kind of, depressing, I guess, in terms of the prospects of that ever being a thing. But yeah, I really don't know, but I agree with you. It's unfortunate. There are, I guess, enough people who still walk a middle line and want to do really good cultural research that has relevance to big questions about human evolution. And I think more and more young evolutionary social scientists are taking that approach. Many of my friends that are working at the intersection of psychology and cultural anthropology and animal behavior. So I hope that's more the vision of the future, but I'm not sure that many cultural anthropologists, like I said earlier, would agree with me about that. But yeah, funny to hear that it's that long of a strife, and it continues to be the same.
I have one point that I'd add to that, and that is that the problem with to a lot of those human scientists is when someone suggests a biological explanation, they immediately equate that with genetical hardwiring. And so I believe there's an area of looking at cultural effects and developmental effects on hormonal and various other physiological processes, which are emphatically not immediately, they're variable, they're not hardwired in the same way. And I've tended to think that work that shows that similar situations under different cultural regimes have quite different hormonal consequences for cortisol or sex hormones or what have you, might be one way to try and coax them off the assumption that biological explanations are necessarily implying a genetic basis to the variation you're seeing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think Joe Henrich, for example, has been great in that regard. His book, Secret of Our Success, has a lot of nice examples of how culture shapes the brain and how it shapes hormone profiles and just basically everything about our biology. And I also saw some really nice pieces as well at the kind of beginning of the COVID pandemic, where anthropologists were also talking about some of the studies that were, for example, like, is just as being trained an anthropologist, had to roll my eyes a bit, but just such a history of people in biomedicine and also psychology, just being very naive about race and basically being like, oh, well, there's an average difference between, African Americans and European Americans in this condition. Therefore, there must be a genetic difference. And let's look for the gene or the, whatever that explains that. And there were some really nice pieces talking about, for example, some of the data showing particularly high rates of mortality among African Americans in the US, and explaining how, that can be explained culturally in relation to this broader, system of inequality and structural racism, and how that affects biology over developmental time, not because of genetics, but because of differential environmental exposures. So I think there's a lot of great work out there making that argument. And yeah, I would also say that there are a lot of people at the intersection of evolutionary social sciences who do speak way too cavalierly and don't think deeply enough about the mechanisms of behavior. And for example, in behavioral genetics, people continue to use these classical quantitative genetic models that assume everybody has randomly distributed environments and don't account for social genetic effects, et cetera, and then make these really strong claims like a third of the variance in income and is explained by genetic aptitude. There is a lot of that work that is promulgating those bad ideas, and then there's this counteracting force. So yeah, I totally agree with you that counteracting force is important and necessary, but there continues to be a lot of people who are promoting naive kind of genetic determinism as well about behavior that are at least walking under the banner of biology in the public eye. So yeah, it's just something we have to keep combating, I think, in public discourse.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, and I think your study is a good example how diversity in human behavior can be adaptation to environment, but of course there's no reason to believe that these human societies are genetically different. And we have another question by Eduardo.
Yes, I'll just make a quick comment. I think that Tim's comment really could give us an opportunity for a long conversation. My comment would be that I think there's a lot for us to do as well in terms of being more humble and modest with our examination. I mean, again and again, we write our own grants and papers. Everything we do, we start from the assumption that it has a genetic component. When most of the times, for those of us studying systems in the field where we limit ourselves to observational data that spans, if we're lucky, 2 generations, we seldom have any data to infer a genetic basis, at least in the way that we teach in our introductory courses to undergrads. So we have not shown variation, we have not shown inheritance, we have not shown differential reproductive success. So there's a lot before we go on to how the cultural anthropologists are still reading literature from the 70s and 80s, because that made a splash at the time of E.O. Wilson and Stephen Jay Gould, etc. I mean, many of them are stuck there. But we need to look inside as well and really start understanding that for most of what we do, and I'm speaking for our own research program, we just have no solid evidence for concluding genetic basis for most of what we describe. So that's a quick comment. I think it's a fascinating topic. It'd be great to follow up on this. I want to go back to data, which for me is central to this. And I enjoyed Carsten's asking for you to share. I mean, so many of us don't really know enough about the standard cross-cultural samples. And one of the things that and the little I know is because I happen to be in an anthropology department. I think it would be mistaken to assume that these 140 societies have any kind of data or information that would pass the test of year 2020. I mean, the reason I mentioned the example of Margaret Mead is because I was reading, there's yet one more book criticizing the extent to which the influences that she has had are justified by her 11-month study in the Samoa Islands, where she was 23, 24 and couldn't speak the language. So the truth is that she could merely get a PhD dissertation these days out of what she did on the ground. And that's my concern with this database. And it applies both to Panteria, when we look at a study done in the 70s. I mean, with some of my colleagues who are already in the midst of arguing this to an editor. We need to judge the quality of the study with the standards of today. I don't care if it was influential at the time. We wouldn't like people to develop a vaccine for COVID using data from last century. We would say, no, it doesn't pass the test. So yes, they may have been interesting, they may have been influential at the time. We need to see if today, with the standards we have now, they meet the bar of, I'm going to include them in a comparative study. And we'll be surprised. Many of these studies of societies would not make that pass. That's I think, something we have to keep reminding ourselves. It's not just studies of animals. Anthropologists may have done wonderful studies in the past, but I mean, were they able to talk to the locals? How long did they spend there? You'll be amazed if you start checking on how these data, the actual work behind coding of any of these 140, 160 societies. I think there's a lot for us to do there.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo again what we said before, I definitely agree with you that better data is going to be the way forward in terms of getting a finer picture on some of these questions, and getting down to, like you said, to questions about like selection and cultural versus genetic causes of behavior. I think all that just needs better long-term field data, better models, and better rigor in terms of what constitutes sufficient data to make a claim. At the same time, I do want to respect the efforts of those anthropologists, because one, if anything, I might think that the quality of the data has gone down rather than going up in terms of ethnographic descriptions, because historically it was more common, one, because anthropology, partly because of its colonial history, was a very well-established and well-respected discipline where many big intellectuals at the time were involved in cross-cultural studies. There was also an effort to systematically document certain kinds of things repeatedly across societies, like, who's taking care of whom? Is it patrilineal or matrilineal inheritance? And various kinds of like basic stock things that anthropologists would document. I think a lot of the push against comparative research has also come at the cost of standardized data collection, where of course we have to put standardized in air quotes because it's ultimately qualitative data pushed through the perceiver that wrote down that information. But I guess the results that we find, at least in our study and in many of the other previous studies, are robust to subsetting the samples. And in general, the patterns that we find are consistent across studies. So a lot of the ecological effects that we look at on things like food sharing are also related to ecological effects on childcare practices, are also related to ecological effects on cooperative hunting and things like that. And I guess, I always feel lame when I make these arguments because you sound like, someone defending junk science, but the patterns would probably not be there if it was just noisy, bad data. The fact that you see functionally consistent relationships between the measures in relation to objective ecological data, and acquired from, like, our ecological measures are based on satellite data across the globe that goes back decades and is as best as possible spatially and temporally localized. So although I totally agree with you that better data is the way forward, I don't want to throw under the bus the extensive efforts of many anthropologists, notwithstanding some great funny exceptions like you just mentioned, where clearly the quality of that data is questionable. But there are many societies we may never observe ever again, or which were, otherwise quote unquote lost, or, literally lost through, imperialism or whatever. There's a lot of knowledge that I think is only available through that data. For us to then now go forward, I agree with you that quantitative measures are important, but I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I guess.
Okay, and then there is a question by Suleima, please.
Yes, hi, this is Suleima Tang Martinez at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. I'm retired. I guess I have two questions and comments having to do both with the database issue that Karsten brought up a little while ago, and also with the biology does not mean hardwired. With regard to the database, I wonder if the information in the database took into account stratification in societies, because I was thinking about societies in which the mother has very little involvement and other people do most of the bringing up of the kids. And it seems to me that is probably more likely to happen only in parts of society when you have highly stratified societies, so that the wealthier components of society are able to hire nannies or wet nurses. And so I am wondering whether that was taken into account, and whether there, what you think about that, and whether in fact some of those data that you showed may actually reflect some of that, like were all aspects or all segments of society looked at, or were only wealthy societies in which people could afford to have, or royalty where they could afford to have wet nurses and nannies might be the reason why you get that type of result. And then I just wanted to add that in terms of the biology is not hardwired, one of the things that I have found immensely exciting in terms of sort of helping us to understand this issue of biological determinism and so on, is that you mentioned culture, but the other thing is epigenetics, which I think really goes a long way into explaining how environment can affect phenotypes that appear to be more genetically determined, but in fact the environment is critically important in the final genotype. So culture plus, I think, epigenetics. So I just, wondered what your comments would be.
Yeah, thanks. So about stratification, we didn't directly include a measure of stratification, but I totally take your point. I would say two things. So one, statistically, we looked at whether the effects varied considerably between subsistence modes, and we didn't really find any strong support for that, although that could just be a sample size issue. But at least statistically, there wasn't clear support that, say, foragers showed a different relationship to ecological variation than did societies with agriculture. But also I would say, I think maybe Karsten's focusing on the Romans gives the wrong impression. The vast majority of societies in the sample are smaller scale societies that are engaging in smaller scale forms of agriculture or foraging. And so although there are some societies where I think that really clearly could be an explanation, I wouldn't say that the patterns we see, for example, across foragers could really be explained by social stratification. But certainly explaining variation across human societies outside of the SCCS, totally agree. I mean, and I think this is one of the difficulties, especially if you want to study this in an industrialized context, is there are so many diffuse kinds of costs and benefits, like being paid or kind of very indirect forms of benefit that you might directly receive for care, which might have nothing to do with the environment because you might be so buffered from the environment anyway, or like you said, your class might determine something about the kind of care you receive. And then your second comment was about epigenetics. I'm not in any way an expert in that, but I mean, I would say, certainly that is an important factor in explaining human variation. In my PhD work, I am now using some quantitative genetic methods that are, I think, a little more advanced and more appropriate for human societies to look at some of the variation we see among the Tsimane. And we're expecting, based on some of the stuff that we're already doing already, that we're providing some evidence that strong conclusions about the genetic basis of some of these traits, irrespective of the environment, is naive, and that, like you said, gene environment interactions and potentially epigenetic environmental interactions, although we can't directly measure that in our study, are being overlooked and are very crucial. So yeah, I mean, genetic expression is also plastic. It's not just the phenotype. So I totally agree with you. And yeah, I mean, the good thing, I guess, in that regard is that humans have led the way in developing genetic methods and continue to. So hopefully, epigenetic markers and the ability to sequence those outside of large-scale industrialized societies becomes more feasible in the future. It's just very costly and hard to do that kind of sampling, especially in a field site, far away where you don't have lab facilities available immediately and so on. But people are looking at that. So yeah, good point.
Thank you, and it was really an interesting talk.
Thanks.
Yes, Jordan, thank you very much. I mean, it was really fascinating talk. And I mean, also Lauren, who had to leave and wrote this in a message, and many people said this so. And thanks a lot to everyone for a very lively discussion, interesting discussion. I think we learned a lot today, and I'm still very much convinced that human behavior is influenced by its environment and is adaptive. I mean, anything else would be against anything that makes sense to me. The quality of databases is an ongoing topic here, and I would predict with a better quality database, you would find the same pattern stronger and even clearer. And it would be great if that will become possible at some stage, because I think the last 50 years, the people that worked in the field, they have done a great job. And even though the cultures are changing, this was always the case. So with this, I'm stopping the live stream on YouTube, and I would really like to thank you again for this great talk, and everyone for your contribution, for staying here with us for so long, and for all your